None of us want to be a part of churches that only has mature believers. We want to be reaching new people in our communities and showing and explaining to them the love and the gospel of Jesus. And so today on Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 tips to preaching to seekers.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Androsian. Joining me is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 6 tips for preaching to seekers.
Plus 1.
7 tips for preaching to seekers.
All right, let's go. 7 tips here.
Here we go.
If you want to, all of us, right, we don't just want to preach to Christians. We want non-believers, seekers, doubters, whatever you want to describe them, coming to our church, learning about Jesus, hopefully growing a relationship with them.
Of course.
If you want them to come and actually stick around, as Tim Keller, who's a pastor in New York City, theologian, many of you are probably familiar with him, he talks about how you need to preach to them and eventually they'll start showing up because people will start thinking, my friends need to hear this, my coworker needs to hear this, they'll start coming. And so even if you can see everybody and you know everybody at your church and most of them are Christians or whatever, you still want to preach as if non-believers are in the room because that is how they'll show up. And even Christians, all Christians have doubts and questions as well. Yep. So it's good for everybody involved.
Totally.
So here is number 1. We talked about this a little bit in our last episode, but you always, and by always, I mean always.
Oh, always.
Qualify context and characters. Every time you're in a text in the Bible, even for us, we talked about this. We're in 1 Corinthians right now, which we've been in for like 4 months so far. I always bring in the message saying who Paul is, who the Corinthians are, why they wrote this letter, and how it applies. Like you want to assume they don't know anything because they don't. So if it's a context of a letter, you don't just read the passage, especially if it's like the main biblical text of that Sunday. Yeah. Even if you're in a book, you don't need to spend 5 minutes, but just 30 seconds, get everyone up to speed. Or characters, like if you're reading a story of Jesus healing the blind man or Paul or Peter, whatever, like assume that nobody knows who they are and just spend 5 seconds just saying, here's who this person is. You don't have to go into all the background and all their history and why this person matters and everything they've done or whatever. But by just saying, here's who they are, it gets everybody on the same page and it acknowledges, oh, I understand that not all of you know what's going on here. And it makes people feel included and not stupid, because if you make people feel stupid, they'll stop listening.
Yeah. Speaking of giving context for characters, you know what you did when you started this?
What did I do?
You said something that Tim Keller said, and then you give context for who Tim Keller was.
There you go.
Because you might not know who Tim Keller is.
That's right.
But also, I was going to say is, this is kind of hard. This advice is kind of hard to take in. What I'm about to say is might be kind of hard to do, but try and imagine that you don't know anything about the Bible when you're hearing this. And I get if you're a pastor, that's hard to actually do in real life. But if you've never heard the Bible, if you're at church for the first time, it's weird, kind of. It's weird to hear we're preaching from a letter that a guy wrote to this church thousands of years ago. You know what I mean? It's hard to wrap your mind around. It's hard to wrap your mind around miracles, that these are things that actually happen. These aren't just stories that we're reading. And so and like you said, you don't have to spend the entire time giving a background and history on things. That's very boring. But giving some context of just, hey, this is something that really happened, or this is a letter that this guy wrote and this is the reason for it. Just give enough clarification for me as if I was a non-believer to say, okay, I can at least follow with you to see where you're going with this.
And we all know too, biblical illiteracy is on the rise between everybody. Right. And what you were talking about, I think is what's referred to the curse of knowledge. Like the more we know, we forget what it's like not to know. But even though, I think you made a great point, like if you're coming to church for the first time, you have no idea what the Bible even is. Like you don't, and so to hear, oh, this was like a real person that at this point and writing to these people, it's like, oh, like this is, whether or not I believe it or not, this is like interesting and it's real life and it's real people. And so always, always, always qualify context and characters to draw people in. That way they'll be interested in what you have to say. Then they'll come back because they won't feel stupid. So that's number 1. Number 2, kind of with it, but explain biblical words. Righteousness, sanctification, justification, all of these words, you should use them. Like, I'm not saying don't use them. They're biblical. People need to learn what they are, know what they are, but you have to explain them. Like when Paul says, so that you may be sanctified in the Lord Jesus or whatever, like, what does that mean? Like, especially words that maybe they're not necessarily, those are kind of biblical examples. I can't think of a non-biblical example, but anytime there's a word that our culture doesn't really use anymore, even if it's not necessarily like a theological concept or word, you need to explain it so that people will be on the same page. If they don't know what you're saying, if they feel like everybody else knows but they don't, and if they want them to actually learn the Bible, then we have to explain what these things are. You don't have to spend 5 minutes, but just say, hey, this is what this word is. Again, even for Christians, if you want them to learn and grow, you've got to explain what words are and what they mean.
That's what I was going to say, is don't assume that your Christians in your congregation have the same amount of knowledge that you do, or are the same place in your spiritual walk. There's a lot of them that are very, I don't want to say immature, might sound kind of harsh, but immature in their faith to where they don't know a lot of these things. So qualifying it and giving some definition of what you're actually talking about isn't just for non-believers, it's for the believers in the room too.
Right. Yeah. So always explain biblical words so that people know what is actually going on. And then they, again, kind of with the first point, it makes them see, oh, like this actually makes sense. Like the writers were actually like, I understand what they were saying. Use biblical words, or explain them so people know what's going on. That's number 2. Here's number 3. We've talked about this in previous episodes about preaching, but use stories, humor, and illustrations. Now, this is not just for the seekers, just public speaking 101 and teaching when Jesus used stories. If you want to give people access to breathe, to come back in when they doze off, to make your application, your points real and real life examples, you want to use things that people connect with. And this is really important, especially for seekers and non-believers, because they aren't necessarily that interested, or maybe not even really care that much what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because who knows why they showed up? Maybe someone dragged them. Maybe a girl they're interested goes and like, well, I got to go here. And so give them a reason to listen in and to lean in and to learn. If you assume everybody wants to be there and everybody knows everything, it turns into like a seminary lecture, which few people are going to track with and few people want to listen to.
Yeah. Yeah. Putting a story or something funny or something to kind of take them out of the seriousness of it and re-engage them right before something that you want them to remember is a way for any, believer, non-believer, anybody to help just kind of reinstill what you're saying.
Another way to put this too is assume people don't care what you have to say. Don't approach preaching like nobody cares. And what are you going to do to make them care? How are you going to make this text come alive, be applicable, engage them? And if you do that, they're more likely to listen, engage, and want to come back.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, the Bible is relatable. Obviously, the Bible is real stories, but it can be hard to relate with sometimes for someone who's new to it. So giving an example or an illustration of how it relates to your life and real life and giving them a real life story in the same context that they live in is much easier for them to relate with sometimes.
Yep, that's good. So use stories, humor, and illustrations. Don't just give them a lecture.
Yeah.
Number 4, tell them where to find the biblical text that you are preaching. Now top 20 episodes somewhere back, we talked about not putting your main biblical text on the screen. So like for us, we're in a series called First Corinthians, and it's not called First Corinthians, but that's the
it's a catchy title.
That's the Bible, the book we're going through. We don't put the main text on the screen. Instead, and we can do this in our context because we have Bibles in all of our seats. We're not portable, so it's able to work for us. It still might be able to work for you in a portable occasion. Anyway, it says First Corinthians, the chapter and the verses, and the page number.
Yep.
So if you don't have a Bible, you can grab the black one, that's in the seat back in front of you, and you don't have to be like going to table of context, look really, feel flustered that everyone's staring at you, that you don't know where it is. You literally just go right to the page number. Or if that doesn't work for you, and you can say, we're in the book of John this morning. So open your Bible up. It's the New Testament, 2/3 of the way in, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. If you're seeing Acts or Romans, you've gone a few chapters over. Like give them a place that they could actually find it so that they don't feel intimidated, so they don't feel like people are staring at them, because they're not. But we've all been in a situation, I feel like, where we didn't know where something was, like Bible study or whatever, and you're like, well, I'm just not even going to open it because you're embarrassed. So tell them where you can find the text. If you have Bibles that are, accessible to anyone around you, like if you have them in seats like we do, even if you put the text on the screen, I would still put the page number so that they know where they can find it.
Yeah. You want people to feel convicted when you preach, but not stupid.
Yeah.
Like, it's funny you mentioned, everyone's done that before. And I mean, I've had times in my earlier adult life, thankfully I can't think of a recent time, where you're flipping through and like, is it Galatians first or Ephesians?
Right.
And I don't know if the person next to me is looking at me at the corner of their eye, and I don't want to look like an idiot. And above just thinking you don't want to look stupid, if someone's flipping around and spending a lot of time, that's time they're not paying attention. Right. That's time that they're just focused on looking for that and not paying attention to what's being preached. So make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, and again, if you never opened a Bible before, you're extremely intimidated. You don't know where to go. You don't know where to look. And so making it as easy as possible, telling them where they can find it, will make them much more likely to open it, and much more likely if they're opening it and they're saying, oh, this isn't, I may not understand it, but it's not as intimidating as I thought. Like it's just the words on a page and here's where it is. So number 4, tell them where to find the biblical text. Make it easy for them. Number 5, acknowledge them. So acknowledge that there are people while you're preaching that may disagree, that may not understand, that may think this is crazy, may not be sure about this whole Jesus thing. Say that. Yeah. Like when you say that makes them realize, oh, like they actually maybe take intellectual doubt seriously. Like they don't just believe this out of thin air. Or they know that I have questions. So they're saying, if you're not like, it makes them feel like I'm allowed to be here. Like they acknowledge that there's people like me here who don't know everything. They're happy that I'm here. They're taking time to explain concepts, not in a way that makes me feel dumb, but it allows me to see where they're coming from. And so I would say, and not just, we talked about this in previous episodes, even in the last episode, I'm not talking about like, hey, if you're new, we're so glad you can hear, but literally saying like, listen, you might not believe this Jesus thing, but here's what Jesus means by this, or here's what this text means, and here's why, we follow it, here's why we trust it. But it's okay to have questions and doubts, and actually verbalizing that at some point every single Sunday, I think is really important.
Yeah, and it helps them think that, or not think that they're necessarily the only one in the room, and that they're being, that it helps them not feel stupid, I guess. I guess is what I'm trying to say. That they're not the only non-believer in the room, even if they are, who knows? But they're not sitting there thinking everyone else knows what you're talking about, or everyone else is just in agreement, and I'm the only one out here that's not. And that's just another thing that kind of, if they're thinking that, takes them out of the situation, helps them, or not helps, but causes them to not focus as much on what you're actually saying.
And it sets them up to listen too. If they hear someone says, you may have always wondered this, or you may wonder why Christians believe or do a certain thing or teach a certain thing. Well, it's because of what we're going to read here. You may not agree with it, but I just want to show you why. And they're like, oh, maybe they're dozing off. They're like, oh, actually, that's really interesting to me.
And you know what? Adding with that, I bet a lot of your believer people are wondering the same things. If you say this, we as believers, we believe this, and this is why. There's probably a lot of people who may be younger in their faith who might be thinking, I don't really know why I believe that.
Exactly.
I mean, that's legitimate. Sometimes people don't think through every single facet of everything, and they follow Jesus. They know they love Jesus, but they don't know all the details. Yeah. And they might be thinking, I don't know the answer to this. And so qualifying it like that helps believers and non-believers.
Yep. So that's number 5. Acknowledge them. Say things like, you may not understand. You may be curious. Maybe not be sure about this Jesus thing, so that they know you're there.
Yeah.
Number 6, answer questions they are asking, and you be the one to bring it up. Like, so you say, you may wonder why, gosh, I probably should have thought of it in a concrete example before I've done this. But you may wonder why the sexual immorality. We're talking about 1 Corinthians 5. That's where I preached this past Sunday, and again this Sunday. Paul talks about sexual immorality. What is sexual immorality? Why does God define sex? Why has God designed it to be between a man and a woman in a covenant of marriage? So I spent a minute, not very long, but talking about God's design for sex, that it is a good, a pleasurable thing, that it binds people together, that God's the one that created it the way that it was. So they're asking, why is this, what's wrong with, especially in our culture today, having sex as long as there's 2 consenting adults? They may not agree with your answer, but at least it says, oh, they're actually thinking through these things. And if they're answering questions that I'm asking, then this is a place that I'm going to come, because I know I'm going to, maybe I won't believe it, but at least I can see where they're coming from. They know that there's people like me here, and they're doing what they can to draw me in. Always, 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 if you can, answer questions people are asking.
Yeah, this goes back to how it can relate to them. It's not just preaching, not just having a certain text and preaching it as in defining what it means and then leaving, but how it can actually relate to them. So what questions are they asking that you can pull the answers from out of this text? Yeah.
Again, what do you think is interesting? Again, I always, I have a few friends that I used to picture, if they were to show up today, what questions would they ask based on this text? And you don't have time to answer all of them, but even answering just one every single Sunday kind of puts in the rhythm of, oh, okay, I'm new here. I don't really understand. He's asking this. And the people that do come, they're going to think, I know my friends are thinking these same things. And I don't always know the answer or remember the answers, but every single week they seem to talk about questions that I know people are asking. I'm going to invite my friends. The best thing you can do is to preach in a way that someone says, I wish my friend would have heard that. Now, you don't want people to not ever think you're talking to them, because you are, but it's like, oh, you want people to be thinking of their non-Christian, non-believing friends and think to themselves, they really need to hear that. If people start hearing that, thinking that, they're going to eventually start inviting their friends.
Yeah.
So number 6, answer questions they're asking. And here's number 7, be honest about your weaknesses. So if you're preaching, people kind of have this idea, especially if they're not in Christian or have faith, whatever, that pastors or priests have it all together or pretend they have it all together. Then they see all these scandals, all these things. Like, just be honest that you don't have it all together. Like, share appropriate stories of times that you've blown it. Like, if you're relatable, it breaks down all these stereotypes and walls that people build up of what they think pastors are.
Yeah.
And when you show that you're just a normal person, that the text that you're preaching, like, you're preaching this not as someone who has it figured out, but as someone who's learning with everybody else. When you make yourself human, because you are human, people are going to be like, oh, they're just like me. They're learning. They're not any more special than I am. I can figure this thing out, and maybe I'm interested in Jesus if this is like something that normal people do.
Yeah, and I think I don't know, pointing out weaknesses that aren't the same ones that people always point out. It helps, and I'm trying to think of an example. But recently, this wasn't in a preaching situation, but I heard someone give their testimony. They talked about how they had a real big struggle with anger previously before becoming a Christian. And I remember thinking afterwards that that's not something that people usually say. You know, I'm sure tons of people have, and tons of people have said that, and tons of people have thought it. But that's not like the stereotypical, I lied, or I used to drink a lot, or something like that. It's always kind of like the same few. But to go to something that, because we all have struggles that aren't the cool ones or whatever you want to say, but to go to something that you don't typically hear, I think is big. And also I would say to be honest about your weaknesses, but you don't necessarily have to point it out if it's not a weakness. And that might sound weird, but I've heard pastors preach about different things and then make it a point to say, now this isn't a struggle that I've had, or go in that. And to me, all I'm thinking is, well, great. I'm glad you pointed that out. It's a struggle that I have, but you can't relate to it. But
then even with that too, kind of the opposite. We were talking about, acknowledge them, answer questions they're asking, not assuming they know everything. Like even saying things like, no one in this room probably struggles with this. Like that's also not good, because people might do. I think it's Tim Keller that says this, who I mentioned earlier. He says people resonate. Maybe it's not. I don't know who it was. People resonate with people admire your strengths, but they resonate with your weaknesses. And so if you can be honest about your struggles, draws people in, shows them you're just like them, I think it's really powerful.
Yeah.
So again, those are 7 ways, 7 things. I can't even speak.
7 things.
6 plus 1, as we talked about earlier, that you can do to preach to seekers. Number 1, always qualify context and characters. 2, explain biblical words. 3, use stories, humor, and illustrations. 4, tell them where to find the biblical text you're preaching from. 5, acknowledge them. 6, answer questions you know they're asking. And number 7, be honest about your weaknesses. So thanks for being with us today in Practical Church Planting. As always, practicalplanting.com/questions. We also have a Facebook group that you can join to talk to other church planters and people in ministry, see what's going on.
Yep.
Thanks for listening today, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planting. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planting, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planting on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.